Welcome to Pirate Politics, where we prepare for your next political conversation. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, a political science professor at the University of Houston.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus, also a political science professor here at the University of Houston. And this week, we're definitely going to use those degrees, my friend.
Absolutely.
Because instead of our kind of usual coverage of what's going on in federal and state and local governments, we're going to talk about the big picture of the separation of powers. So we're going all the way back to graduate school, undergraduate training, because we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how it is that the separation of powers works, some of the dynamics that shape that relationship, and maybe understand kind of where we are in our kind of current moment. Because it's always, I think, a good time for us to reinvest in this, for us to rethink this. I'm always reminded of Thomas Jefferson's phrasing about the way revolution should happen, right? And he may have meant an actual, musket and bullet revolution, or he might have just meant an intellectual revolution where we're thinking about the ways that separation of powers functions. And the question is, does it really function the way that we think it does? And does the Constitution still hold and it properly kind of motivates the way that the different institutions are operating? So that's the kind of motivation for the week. That's our discussion point for the week. To dig into this, we, of course, are in a world and time when there's a lot of concern about how the separation of powers is being respected. For instance, Donald Trump talked about the separation of powers in the Constitution. He was asked by a member of the media whether it was his responsibility to uphold the Constitution. And he said, quote, "I don't know," unquote. And I don't want to say that he's saying he doesn't know if he should uphold the Constitution definitively. He's talking about this in the context of an issue, but it does beg this question about how much it is the case that the separation of powers still functionally holds. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how we think about this, how political scientists think about this relationship and some of the particular dynamics therein. I think to start, the way I always talk about the separation of powers when I write about it, when I teach about it, is that it's not so much about the separation of powers, but about the kind of shared nature of powers across separate institutions. So they all share powers together. And it's not so much about you do this and we do this. It's just that we do it together. But it's the how we do it together that's the big issue. And that's the conundrum mostly that gets sorted out by the courts or by the institutions themselves. So like little kids, they don't always get along well, right?
Yep.
And how much they like each other does make a big difference in terms of whether it works or not. So how do you think of the separation of powers in a broad sense? And how does this bring us to our kind of present moment?
Well, I think when we go back historically, the big question is why the framers said, this is a good idea. Let's have three branches.
Make this the most complicated we can.
And they, to a certain extent, succeed into that. But it was and has, I think, three very important reasons. The first one was creating three branches of government, so none of them became too powerful. Mm-hmm. And one way or the other, the goal was to protect liberty, right? Free enterprise, liberty of voting or choosing to worship or not to worship, et cetera, et cetera. And the first one was fear of tyranny. Having just fought the British monarchy, said probably this is a bad idea.
We need some rules here,
We need some rules. Also, you have very important influences from Enlightenment, philosophers, Montesquieu, so on and so forth, Rousseau, that also that is incorporated, that whole line of French political thought. And finally...
You just wanted to bring up French again so you could
I know, so
pronounce Montesquieu properly.
Montesquieu.
But the balance is what they were looking for, right?
And finally is not only balance, but also checks. So the checks and balances is a very interesting and very complicated dynamic in which one branch checks the other branch and vice versa. And then everybody checks and balances each other until there is wait, what? Where is the ball? So I think that those are the main important things. The question is what it does to the balance of powers today in terms of how we think about separation of powers. And in theory, it has to create, I would say, tension
Yes.
and
Okay.
deliberation.
Yeah.
Not so much today about the deliberation, but certainly about the tension.
Yes.
Prevents one way or the other abuses of power from one branch in particular. And in theory, it's going to encourage accountability.
Yeah.
So I think that those are the main factors that play into our modern political system.
Yeah.
And the question that I have for you is, do you think if it's outdated in the ways that we are conducting our American political system?
Is it still functioning? I still consider the Constitutional work of genius in that it has this perfectly kind of calibrated balance. If all the institutions are not only looking out for themselves, but also respecting of the rules, then it can work perfectly. It's like an old engine in like a 1978 Dodge. It just functions properly if you keep it lubricated, if you keep it maintained. That's a question though, because sometimes the calibration doesn't work quite well or things go wrong. It's just sort of because of the institutional design, because of the people in the institutions. That's where things get to be a little bit more complicated. So the concerns people have about the executive moving too fast or moving kind of beyond its own parameters is really that. It's this, that you can have this thing be out of whack in any number of ways. But in principle, the system is supposed to be designed so that each of these agencies, each of these institutions is protecting themselves. So a couple of good examples. One is the purveyance of TikTok. This was a law that Congress wrote. The law says TikTok will go away on this date if there's not a buyer that's a U.S.-based buyer, right? That's the kind of whole tagline. But
bipartisan law.
In a bipartisan, this is not a kind of, and this was something that, because of security concerns, they wanted to put into law. So again, as we know, Congress is the one that writes the laws. They have a particular reason for doing so. They have all kinds of incentives and abilities to do this because the Constitution gives them these powers and the courts have said it's okay. So in this case, they write this law in such a way to say after a certain number of days it goes away unless there's a buyer. But they also wrote into the law a stipulation that the executive branch, if they want to, can delay the decline of TikTok or the loss of TikTok for a certain number of days because there is potential for there to be a buyer, right? Recognizing that there's not like a firm deadline that's always going to be met. They have to have some flexibility. So the Congress gives the president some flexibility when it comes to the implementation of this. That to me is a part of the system which, if every institutional kind of element is designed properly and they're following their own rules and respecting the rules of the other branches, then they're able to facilitate this accordingly. So that's why the process can work really well. Sometimes it doesn't work that well. So for instance, in the student loan question, right? Joe Biden issues an executive order saying student loan debt is forgiven. That's a tough call because a lot of conservatives said, wait a minute, this is not a constitutional kind of legality and Congress didn't appropriate this money. This is simply just kind of you by fiat saying this is untrue. So as an executive overreach, the potential for there to be a serious problem is there. So what the Trump administration did was to say, well, guess what? We can't do that. We're basically rewriting that or undoing that law. And Congress doesn't have to do anything for that to facilitate. So we can talk more about executive power and unilateral power and how that works. But at the bottom line, it's this. And that's that the concern since at least the 1970s has been that presidents are doing more than they're supposed to be able to do, right? Basically, the design of the executive is that it's supposed to have modest powers. Their powers are aggravated and expanded because either Congress lets them do it or because they're reading a muscular version of what their executive responsibility is. So a lot of these puzzles that the incoming presidents face is the following. You have high expectations, but low capacity to operate. That means presidents are going to do everything they can to try to find a way forward. And that means they're going to do things like issue executive orders that might be unconstitutional. But the whole goal is that the system can check that. And so, again, the question I'd throw back to you is the system properly checking this? Is our Dodge car running effectively, or should we buy a newfangled model that has like more bells and whistles? It's got GPS. We don't have to like look at a physical map anymore, right?
Correct.
Are we doing this the right way, and is it functioning in a way that the framers intended, and that the system has to be properly calibrated to work?
Well, I think the intention of the Constitution is to basically make, in theory, each branch work with the others to govern.
Yeah.
But that can slow the decision-making process, right? And that can, I guess, ceteris paribus, as the economists say, everything constant, encourage this negotiation and compromise.
Yeah.
But there is none. I mean, that part of the negotiation and compromise
Great point, yeah.
is not there.
Yes.
And you can think about different ways, especially when you have, in some cases, divided government. That means that one party control the House or the Senate and another party controls the White House.
Yeah.
But even in terms of when you have unified control in both in Congress and the executive, which can also slow down things. So on the one hand, you have one pull factor that says like, yeah, you have, if you want to accomplish your political agenda, hurry, get things done now. But then the institutional setting, right? The rules of the game say like, no. This is a marathon. Take it easy. We have to negotiate. And you're a sprint. It's like, hell no, I'm not going to negotiate anything. Let's just ram it
I'm
through.
just going to do this,
And that's the incentive that you have to use this unilateral power that the executive always tries to use, regardless of the president.
So true. And I think that is the problem, is that we are in an Amazon world, but the Constitution is designed to be like farmer's market slow, right?
Yes.
Like you need to have things done fast if you're a politician. You want to have your agenda met. You promised X, Y, and Z. You want that done as soon as possible. But the system is not designed to be like that. And presidents recognize this, right? They are hemmed in by partisanship, right, which they have to fight with the Congress about and sometimes with the judiciary about. They have different electoral time horizons. So presidents have, 4 years, but really it's like 2 years. And really, if you look at it, it's like 6 months.
Yes.
That's not enough time. And in a fast-paced political world, really hard to worry about. There's an organizational disconnect where Congress is very highly centralized, whereas the presidency is sort of more diffuse in some ways. And also the executive has so much more experience than Congress. Congress are generalists, and the White House tends to be more specific. So they have like agencies that can do one thing, foreign policy or health and human services or housing. So those sorts of dynamics make this to be a really frustrating enterprise for presidents. And so, like we've been talking about, presidents try to do what they can to kind of fast forward through that, right, to jump over those hurdles. But it's in that jumping over those hurdles where things get into trouble. So that's why we are where we are, right, where the separation of power still works properly if it's calibrated. But when you have certain institutions that have political incentives that outpace their institutional incentives, they're going to do things that people say is unconstitutional or wrong, or you're an authoritarian leader, or et cetera. I think the context here is important. That's that although we may look at a particular case, we may look at a particular policy issue and say, wow, they've gone too far. That might be true, but the system is designed for it to work back into place, right? I'm reminded of the Steele case for Truman in the 50s, right? This is a famous case that sets the tone and parameters for executive power. Basically, this would be a completely unlikely today, right? But what happened in this period was that there was a steel strike. The country needed that material to fight the Korean War. So President Truman, because of the strike, says, guess what? We're taking the means of production. We are going to now, as a federal government, own all of these steel mills. The steel company said, wait a minute, you can't just do that. It goes to the court. The Supreme Court says, yeah, you can't just do that. But the way that you do it is really important, right? In some instances, a law can let you do that. And in some instances, there's a law that won't let you do that. And then there's a kind of gray area in the middle. Presidents love that gray area, right? Article 2 is all about this, right? Just this kind of meaty area where like, we're not sure what to do here. The court gives some guidance, and of course, over time, that's materialized. But the question here is whether or not presidents can go too far. And when they go too far, are there appropriate checks to yank them back into calibration?
I mean, there are appropriate checks to yank them back. It's like a very, very, very slow process.
Right. And we have to wait.
And we have to wait. Why? Because you have the federal court system has different layers. So you start in a circuit court, but then you don't get what you want. Then you go to the appeals court, and then goes back and maybe goes up again and eventually ends up at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, through Mabry versus Madison, decided that, hey, we have judicial review.
Yes.
And that's where we decide if the laws are constitutional or unconstitutional, or if the federal government is following the spirit of the law that was enacted by Congress, because Congress is the one in charge of making laws. So Then, in addition, the Supreme Court has the right to say, it's like, this very particular case, yes, we take it. This one, no, we pass.
Right.
This one, maybe, but I don't know, pass, yes, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And it makes it very slow. Should it be that slow? I think it should be slow because that allow all the justices, Supreme Court justices, to really spend time and thinking about the issue, thinking about jurisprudence, thinking about previous cases, so on and so forth, in order to make a clear, rational decision. Why? Because believe it or not, or agree or not, the Supreme Court also indirectly makes public policy.
So true. Yeah, and I think that the courts have to be independent, right? That's critical.
Oh, yes.
So Alexander Hamilton, who, of course, in addition to being a kind of founding representative of the nation, is the subject of a pretty intense musical.
Yes.
Right?
Pretty intense, indeed.
So he's a great writer, and one of the things he wrote in the Federalist Papers was that the Constitution sets up this policy where the courts have to be independent. And what it says in particular here, what he writes is that the independence of the judges may be an essential safeguard against the effects of occasional ill humors in society. It's a great Hamiltonian phrase, and I think perfectly captures the way that we see how the ambiguities and difficulties and partisan fights over these policy issues then have to get resolved by the courts. So on your point, there's these sort of academic theories about what the courts do. And there's really kind of two big ones. One is that the court basically is supposed to defend minority rights. And that's not like minority as an ethnic or racial group, but just the minority rights of people who have, kind of opinions that are of the majority. And that's sort of something that they're supposed to do across the board. Or maybe but definitely in some cases they're a upholder of the majoritarian regime. What that means is that the court's going to do what the majority of the kind of political atmosphere is asking. So if you've got a period where there's unified government, the president and Congress are pulling in the same direction, an issue goes to the courts. The courts look at the issue and they say, yeah, we agree with what the kind of prevailing political winds are. That's a kind of separate theory. So I guess I'm posing this to you. Do you think that the courts are too partisan in how they go about their business, whether it's what people perceive to be the case or whether the actual outcomes are too partisan?
That's a difficult question because
that's like a whole other.
Oh yes,
that's like a series of of shows, right?
I mean, and it's difficult because on the one hand, indeed, justices, judges, they also have ideological leanings and political leanings, and it's very hard to abstract yourself. But I would think that it depends on how you see the role of the judicial system and how you see the role of the Constitution in terms of being a traditionalist and interpret the Constitution as it was written hundreds of years ago within that very particular political context of our founding, or if it is a guiding document that has to be updated in taking into account current political times and economic times, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the most important views of how you interpret the Constitution. Depending on which side you're sitting on, your interpretation of a particular law, whether Congress and the executive of the same political party pulling together, is going to have different interpretations, right?
Academics find divergence in terms of when and how these two things are in conflict. So what you're talking about is a conflict between a judge who has a partisan political opinion that's informed by their upbringing or by their own partisanship in various ways, or one who simply follows the law, right, as strictly and clearly as possible. That's the attitudinal model, the ideological model versus the kind of legal model, which is sort of the inverse of it. It's not to say those things won't be merged, and distinguishing between them is complicated, but basically scholars look at this and find that it depends on the issue, right?
Correct.
Where you see one or the other of this sort of becoming more prominent. But the fact is it does happen. So there's a lot of talk about activist judges and they're going too far and straying from the nature of the Constitution. That's part of this system. I mean, it's impossible to get away from it. I mean, there have been cases in the court's history where they have made political blunders that had to be remedied down the road. Obviously, slavery, just to pick one, right? The biggest one is one of them. And they've righted the ship on that and corrected. But there have been lots of times where the courts gone one way and make policy, as you say, but they have to have later on those corrections. So the bottom line, though, is that you have to have a judiciary that's independent and is able to articulate these things and adjudicate these things without the political retribution. And that is another kind of question here, is whether the other branches of government are effectively able to police the judiciary, right? So like we're talking about this thing in the full context of how all these things operate, right? All the different branches are checking each other. The way that the courts get checked is that they could be impeached.
Correct.
There's lots of threats about this, but it almost never happens, right? I mean, the number of times in history has been like 15, right? So really, really very infrequent. But the threats are always there. And people perceive that any kind of grievances with the courts could motivate to the point where people then have this outsized opinion that the courts should be trimmed, or we should take away some of the cases from them, or we should change the jurists, et cetera. So are we at the point now where there's a concern that the judiciary is not independent enough?
Well, again, political ideology is going to color your opinion.
So true, yeah.
And if you agree with the current political ideology of President Trump's political ideology and the fact that he was able to nominate and the Senate confirm a bunch of new Supreme Court justices that perhaps tend to be on that side, then you're going to agree.
Yeah.
If you're more liberal, then you're going to say, oh, absolutely, he's 100% political, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that the evidence in terms of what we have seen of this current Supreme Court, I would say the 2.0 justice, Roberts court, is that the message has been mixed.
Yes.
On some issues, we have seen the Supreme Court given everything to the Trump administration, first term, second term, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And in some cases, is the completely opposite side. You have seen the more liberal justices siding with more conservative, crossing the aisle, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a healthy exercise.
That's good, yeah.
And I think that eventually is looking at these from a different perspective and thinking, well, yes, it might be political. Yes, it might not be political. But when you look at the evidence, it's like everything reverts to the mean and everything goes back to essentially where it needs to be at that particular time.
Which is that the court's protecting its own sovereignty. And that's what all the institutions are supposed to do. And so you could read into their decisions that it's too political or too supportive of the presidency or Donald Trump. That's probably a misreading, because like if you really look at what they're doing, they're trying to protect their own identity. And that's the whole notion of what each institution is supposed to do. So at the outset, we said the president didn't know if he was supposed to uphold the Constitution. The short answer, the kind of more technical answer, is yes. They're supposed to uphold the Constitution with respect to their own political behaviors inside their institutions.
Right.
They don't have to like protect the other institutions per se, but they have to respect the rules of the other institutions, and that's possibly a difference there. So that's in particular what the court is argued to be doing. But you make a really good point about the appointment process, which is a key shared function. So I do a lot of writing about the appointment process and the ways that they share, and one of the things I find is that this diffuse responsibility is really critical. Now, they do share responsibility. It makes it look like, oh, the president's putting judges into place. Well, that's true, but what we don't see is that members of Congress are a big part of that. They're requesting certain people to be in a particular place. There's a sort of process whereby the senior senator from the state in question is able to accomplish that. We know that when requests are made from members of Congress to the White House, that people who are committee chairs, ranking members, people who are ideologically close to the president are all more likely to get their judicial picks into place.
Correct.
And so it's a lot more shared than we think, because all we see is the outcome. But if you really dig into it, as political scientists are wont to do, you can see a different kind of dynamic at play. So it's important to look past just the surface concern, which is that who's winning and who's losing, right? It's really more than that. It's about those institutional dynamics. The last thing to think about is really one of the most important, and that's unilateral power. How presidents use it and to the extent to which the system is supposed to support it. The mention of unilateral power is very scant in sort of the Constitution. So a lot of people look at this and say, well, presidents are always going too far. But the fact is that the courts have sanctioned the ability for presidents to operate, especially inside the executive branch. They need a way to tell agencies what to do. Here's the rule. And that's legitimate within the institutional kind of branch of the presidency. It may not be, of course, they can't dictate what Congress does or what the courts do, but they do have the ability to operate independent of it. The public likes it to the extent to which their president is doing it. But the public is actually really reluctant to embrace unilateral power by itself. So again, it's a partisan story about how unilateral power gets applied.
Well, absolutely. And once again, given the constitutional design, the executive branch is responsible to execute the laws of the land.
Yes.
What does that mean, right? That is huge latitude.
Yeah.
You can interpret one law to say, et cetera, and that's a latitude that the executive branch has, especially when you're thinking about the bureaucracy and how to implement what Congress intended you to implement.
Yes, this is the key point,
That is a key point because, intentions are everything, right?
Yes.
And that's where things can get done or not get done, and that's when the court system enters to interpret if those actions by executive fall within the Constitution or not.
Yeah, and sometimes the Congress might want the president to be in charge, right? There's stuff they don't know about or they're not sure how it's going to play out in 10 years and 20 years. So they write the law ambiguously on purpose, giving the president the power to do it. So presidents down the road take it. So all the actions that Donald Trump takes, for instance, are all based upon a kind of statutory interpretation of what the law lets them do. Congress could take it back if they wanted to, a la the separation of powers. The balance is critical. But if they're not going to balance it, then there's nothing you can do.
Absolutely. And that is it for this week. I hope you enjoyed this special episode. I'm Jeronimo Cortina.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus. More party politics next week.